Why was she strapping into a jet that already looked half dead before it even left the ground? The crews joked about it, called it a flying scrapyard patched with scars, but to Rebecca Havoc Lane it was more than a machine. It was armor, a stubborn old beast that refused to quit just like her. The A-10 was never beautiful, not like the sleek fighters the new cadets envied, but beauty didn't matter here. Survival did. And in this desert, survival was something that laughed at statistics, chewed up pilots, and spat out wreckage across valleys that had no names. Her hands tightened the straps across her chest, each buckle snapping home like a reminder, this could be the last time. The cockpit smelled of hydraulic fluid and scorched electronics. Her bird had been stitched back together twice in the last week. Titanium bathtub patched with rivets, wiring rerouted in ways that made the techs shake their heads. She should have asked for a replacement. She should have argued the way some of the men did, but she didn't. She trusted this ugly creature of steel and bolts, trusted it with her life. And perhaps more than that, she trusted it because it mirrored her, scarred, worn, but unbroken. The radio chatter filled her headset before she even powered the systems. Fragmented reports of enemy armor pushing hard against Allied lines. Convoys swelling like a flood, threatening to break through. She caught her general's voice cutting through the storm, clipped and cold, barking orders like hammer strikes. Hold the valley. At all costs. At all costs, that phrase sat heavy in her stomach. The general was far away in some command tent, watching dots on a screen. He didn't smell the sand after it mixed with blood. He didn't feel the heat when your cockpit filled with smoke. Rebecca did, and she knew what all costs really meant. The ground crew slapped the fuselage as her engines roared to life, the warthog growling with its iconic snarl. It wasn't encouragement, it was ritual, almost like a blessing. As if those men knew that once she rolled forward, their hands might be the last human touch she ever felt. She glanced across the flight line. 3 other A-10s were spooling up beside her, each one ready to fly into the meat grinder. These were men she'd flown with for months, men who trusted her as their anchor in the sky. Some of them still didn't take her seriously when they joked in the mess hall. A woman at the stick of a warthog was something they didn't brag about to outsiders. But when the sun bled across the horizon, when the valley became a crucible, she was Rebecca, the outsider. She was Havoc. And Havoc didn't miss. She pushed the throttle, rolling out onto the runway as the rising sun lit the desert like a furnace. Dust rose in her wake. Her bird was alive now, engines screaming, the ground trembling as if it feared what was coming. She felt her heart sink with the vibrations through the seat. And then, wheels up. She was climbing into the dawn with her squadron, 4 shadows slicing across an endless sky. The mission was supposed to be simple. Fly low, destroy the armored column, pull out before the air defense wakes up. Simple, but no mission stayed simple when men with missiles waited in the hills. She knew it. Every pilot knew it. And yet they went. The valley stretched out before them like a scar across the earth, jagged and waiting. The first salvos were theirs, rockets streaking ahead, explosions ripping through the desert floor as enemy tanks blossomed into smoke and fire. Her cannon thundered, its growl rattling the sky itself, chewing through steel like it was paper. Allied ground troops cheered through the comms. For a moment, it almost felt controlled. And then it didn't. The first missile screamed upward, white smoke carving the sky like a blade. Then another. Then another. Hidden artillery batteries erupted, their ambush unleashed. The valley turned into a cage, and Rebecca's formation scattered like birds startled by a predator. She caught the flash of her wingman's aircraft tearing apart midair, a burst of flame where a voice had been only seconds before. Another warthog limped away, smoke trailing like a dying comet. She was alone. Alone in the valley, the walls alive with fire. Alone while ground troops screamed into the radio for cover, their voices cracking, their vehicles shredded under the armored push. Rebecca banked hard, forcing the warthog low, hugging the terrain. The radar screamed warnings, lock after lock lighting up her display. Her hands moved without thought, instincts drilled into her bones. She strafed through enemy armor, her Avenger cannon rattling like the drumbeat of war. Each burst saved lives on the ground, but every round also painted her brighter as a target. Tracer fire clawed at her from every angle. Missiles streaked so close she could almost read their markings. One detonated off her wing, peppering the fuselage with shrapnel that tore holes through her skin and the birds alike. Sparks showered her cockpit. Her body slammed against the restraints, but she held, forcing the machine to obey. This was the point where mission stopped being duty and became survival. The point where no one expected you to come home, and she knew it. Somewhere far away, her general would be watching the telemetry, watching her altitude drop, her vitals flash red, her bird trailing smoke. She knew what he'd say. She could almost hear the words in his voice. Havoc is down. But she was not yet. Rebecca tuned out the static of broken calls, tuned out the panicked voices of men on the ground, tuned out the alarms screaming in her ears. All that mattered was the valley floor below, the pocket of soldiers pinned under fire. Their survival balanced on her battered wings. Her hands trembled on the stick, sweat stinging her eyes, but she banked again, forced the bird into another run. Rounds ripped into armored personnel carriers below, shredding them open like tin cans. Soldiers shouted her call sign in disbelief through the radio. They thought she was gone. They thought no one was left. And yet here she was, their last shield. The cockpit shuddered violently as another missile clipped her tail, flipping her world sideways. Metal screamed. Her ribs slammed into the harness. For a heartbeat, she thought it was over, the jagged teeth of the valley rushing toward her canopy. But instinct roared louder than fear. She leveled out. She held. And the bird, broken and bleeding, held with her. Her breath came ragged, chest heaving against the straps. A bruise bloomed across her ribs, pain flaring every time she inhaled. But she ignored it. Pain was proof she was alive. Pain meant she wasn't done. Something primal burned in her chest, a voice older than fear, older than orders, a whisper that cut through the chaos like fire through smoke. Not today, not like this. Her bird clawed back toward the sky, one engine coughing smoke, hydraulics bleeding fluid like lifeblood. She knew she was already a ghost in the general's eyes, declared down, written off, but ghosts could still fight. Rebecca angled her A-10 back into the storm. Her ammo was nearly gone, her rockets already fired. The skin of the jet flapped loose in the slipstream, metal shrieking with every maneuver. And still she pressed on, because if she gave in, those men on the ground would be left to die. And if she survived, if she clawed her way out, she'd carry their voices with her. Their gratitude, their belief that for a moment someone had chosen to stay when retreat was easier. When her last rounds tore through the final line of advancing vehicles, silence echoed in her headset. Then a single voice, cracked and hoarse, whispered over the comms, "Havoc, we owe you our lives." Her throat tightened. She didn't answer, couldn't. Her hands were locked to the controls and her bird was barely flying. One engine was gone, the other failing. Her gauges blinked like dying stars, each warning light another reminder of the impossible odds against her. And still she pointed north. Toward home. Toward a base where no one believed she was coming back. How do you keep flying when the world itself seems determined to pull you out of the sky? Rebecca didn't know if it was instinct, training, or sheer refusal to give in, but she was still in the fight. Her A-10 was a mangled carcass, riddled with holes, hydraulics bleeding out, one engine coughing black smoke. The cockpit was a graveyard of warning lights, each one screaming in its own way, "You shouldn't be alive." And yet she was. The valley stretched behind her now, littered with the wreckage of vehicles she had torn apart. Somewhere down there, men she would never meet were still breathing because she had stayed in the storm. She should have felt relief, pride. Instead, all she felt was the crushing silence of the comms and the suffocating weight of solitude. Her squadron was gone, scattered, burned, vanished into the desert wind. She was the last shadow in the sky, and for all she knew, the last one left at all. She wanted to call out, to hear a voice, To know she wasn't just some forgotten ghost dragging herself north through smoke and fire. But the radio was static, nothing but fractured signals and screams that had long since gone silent. Rebecca tightened her grip on the stick, forcing her eyes back to the instruments. Focus. If she drifted into thoughts, she was dead. If she slowed even for a second, she was a target again. And deep down in the pit of her stomach, she already knew she had been marked as dead anyway. Back at the command center, hundreds of miles away, a general she had once trusted was staring at a monitor. He had seen her altitude drop. He had watched her vital signs blink into the red. He had seen the plume of smoke trailing behind her crippled jet. And with a weary finality, he had said the words no pilot ever wanted spoken. "Havoc is down, we've lost her." It was already entered into the logbook, already whispered across the operations floor. Her name scratched off the mission board, her squadron mourning her, believing she had vanished into the fire. Rebecca didn't know it yet, but maybe, somewhere in her chest, she felt it, the inevitability pressing against her ribs like a blade, the sense of being written off before her story was finished. Her bird groaned as she banked again, trying to claw altitude with one good engine. The controls fought her, stiff as if she were dragging the carcass of a beast through mud. Every jolt sent pain ripping through her body, her ribs already bruised from the harness, her temple bleeding from where the last explosion had slammed her sideways into the cockpit glass. The taste of iron coated her tongue. She wanted to close her eyes, just for a second, but she didn't, because closing her eyes here was a choice, and choices mattered. The desert stretched endless and merciless ahead of her. Each mile felt like a lifetime. Each second stretched thin, pulled taut by adrenaline. She thought of her wingmen, their laughter on the ground, their voices now gone. She thought of the soldiers she had saved, their calls of gratitude echoing in her mind. And she thought of the silence waiting for her if she didn't make it home. Was that what haunted her most? Not death itself, but the thought of dying unseen, dying uncounted, dying while already marked as gone, her last fight erased before she had even landed. Her gauges blinked again, fuel leaking, pressure dropping. She cursed under her breath. She had to nurse the bird north, but the odds were cruel. Even if she survived the mechanical failures, even if the engine held, she was still deep in enemy airspace. Still a beacon of smoke against a sky too wide to hide in. And as if summoned by her thoughts, the radar lit up. Two blips fast, sleek, closing. Enemy interceptors. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. Fighters, hunters, sent to finish what the missiles had failed to do, and in her battered hog there was no chance of outmaneuvering them, no chance of winning a dogfight. Her ammo was gone, her rockets expended. She was a wounded animal and predators had caught her scent. She had seconds to choose. Running wasn't an option, not in this wreck. Fighting wasn't an option, not without weapons. That left one thing. The one thing the warthog had always done best, survive. Rebecca shoved the stick forward, diving low, skimming the desert floor so close she could see dust whip against the canopy. The interceptors screamed overhead, missiles armed, claws bared. She used the only weapon left to her, the terrain. Canyons and ridges blurred past as she hugged every contour, her battered wings inches from the ground. Warning alarms howled. Her bird shuddered with every maneuver, panels rattling loose, sparks flying as her wingtips scraped a canyon wall. But still, she forced it lower, erratic, unpredictable. The fighters circled above, sleek shadows darting back and forth, trying to pin her in. Missiles streaked wide, fooled by her jagged movements through the terrain. The warthog wasn't fast, wasn't elegant, but it was stubborn. It refused to die. And so did she. One of the interceptors made a fatal error. Banking too hard, too low, chasing her into a canyon it couldn't escape. Rebecca caught the glimpse in her rear mirror, the sleek fighter slamming into the rock face in a burst of fire, a predator undone by its own arrogance. That left one. Her pulse hammered in her ears, sweat stung her eyes, her whole body ached, every muscle screaming with the effort of holding the beast together. And still, the second fighter hung on her tail. Her bird rattled, her controls sluggish. She had nothing left to fight with except herself. She pulled one last desperate maneuver, rolling the crippled hog onto its side, skimming a canyon wall so close the metal shrieked. Sparks flew off her wingtip, a shower of fire against stone. The pursuing fighter flinched, forced to pull away or slam into the terrain. That single hesitation, that fraction of a second, was enough. She slipped north, dragging herself across the invisible line into friendly skis. Her breath broke in a gasp. She had made it out for now. But ahead, the horizon wavered. Her controls were nearly gone, her hydraulics bleeding dry. One wheel refused to deploy. Her gauges mocked her with their blinking red. She flicked her comms, voice raw, whispering into the static. Havoc inbound. For a moment, silence answered. And then voices erupted on the line. Disbelieving, shaken. Men and women shouting across the tower, their words tumbling over each other, because in their minds she was already dead, a ghost risen from the grave. On the base, crews sprinted to the runway, emergency vehicles rushing into position. Pilots flooded the line to see for themselves, eyes wide as her silhouette wavered into view, a crippled A-10 crawling home on one engine, smoke trailing like a funeral banner. And in the command center, the general froze. The same man who had declared her down, the same voice that had buried her minutes earlier. His face drained of color as her call sign filled the air. Havoc wasn't down. Havoc was coming home. How do you land when your own plane is already more wrecked than aircraft? Rebecca's eyes burned as she squinted through the cracked canopy. The sun was sinking now, washing the desert in shades of blood red and gold, and ahead, like a mirage, she caught the faint shimmer of the base's landing strip. It didn't look real. It looked like something her mind had conjured up to keep her alive a little longer, a promise of safety just out of reach. But as her bird coughed and rattled beneath her hands, every muscle in her body screamed the same truth. She had one chance to make it. One chance and nothing left in reserve. Her gauges mocked her, fuel almost gone, hydraulic fluid bleeding out, systems failing one after another. The right wheel refused to deploy, jammed somewhere in the twisted underbelly. The cockpit was alive with warning tones, a symphony of alarms that had long since blurred together into a single sound, death closing in. She should have ejected. Any sane pilot would have. But ejection was never an option, not for her. Not when the bird had carried her this far. Not when she had clawed her way through fire and missiles to drag herself back across the line. To abandon it now would be betrayal. And Rebecca Lane had never been good at walking away from a fight. Her hands trembled on the stick. She pressed her lips together, steadying her breath. She could almost hear her instructors back in training, voices from another lifetime. Keep your head. Fly the plane. Fly it all the way in. Fly the plane. That was all she had left. Her radio crackled, a voice sharp, stunned, almost disbelieving. Havoc, is that you? She wanted to laugh, wanted to weep. Instead, her voice rasped back, raw and broken. Inbound, one engine, gear failure, prepare emergency cruise. For a moment, silence, and then chaos. Dozens of voices overlapping, shouts echoing across the channel as ground crews scrambled, medics ran, fire trucks lined the runway. They hadn't believed it until now. They had already mourned her, lowered their heads, whispered prayers for her name. And now, here she was, limping home in a machine that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard fire. Rebecca's vision blurred. Blood trickled from her temple down her cheek, dried stiff against her skin. Her arms ached with the weight of holding the stick, as though she were carrying not just her aircraft but the ghosts of everyone who hadn't made it back. Her wingmen, she saw their faces in the blur of memory, the laughter in the ready room, the sound of their voices before takeoff, and then the silence when their planes went up in flame. Her chest tightened. She wanted to scream, wanted to rage at the sky for taking them while sparing her, but there was no time for grief now. Grief came later, if later ever arrived. The runway grew closer. Her bird shuddered like a dying animal, every vibration rattling her bones. She knew she couldn't bring it down clean. The right wheel wouldn't drop. The hydraulics were too far gone. At best, she'd skid, sparks screaming, metal tearing across concrete. At worst, fire, explosion, the final silence she had fought so hard to outrun. The tower's voice broke through her headset again. "Havoc, you're too damaged. We're advising ejection. Repeat, eject." She almost smiled at the desperation in their tone. They didn't understand. She wasn't leaving this bird. Not after everything it had done to keep her alive. Not after every bullet it had taken for her. She wasn't going to leave it behind, broken and empty, in some enemy valley. If they burned together, so be it. Her voice came back, steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Negative, I'm bringing her home." A hush fell across the channel. Even the tower seemed to understand then. This wasn't about orders. This wasn't about survival percentages or protocol. This was about dignity, about defiance, about not giving the desert the satisfaction of swallowing her whole. Rebecca adjusted her angle, coaxing the crippled warthog toward the strip. The base spread out below, vehicles lined up, crews standing still, every pair of eyes fixed on the dot of smoke crawling across the horizon. The general himself stood among them, silent, his face carved in disbelief. The same man who had declared her down, the same voice that had buried her. Now he waited to see if the ghost he had written off could truly come home. Rebecca swallowed hard, her throat raw. She eased back on the throttle, coaxing the bird down. The runway stretched longer now, rushing up to meet her. Every second slowed, drawn out until each heartbeat felt like an eternity. The left wheel touched first, screaming against the concrete. Sparks erupted, metal grinding as the crippled landing gear strained under the weight. The right side collapsed instantly, slamming the fuselage against the runway. The whole jet screamed in protest, skidding sideways, a shower of sparks and fire suppression foam spraying across the strip. Rebecca's teeth rattled in her skull. Her body slammed against the restraints. Pain flared across her chest, her ribs screaming as the harness dug deeper. She held on, hands welded to the controls, refusing to let go until the bird stopped moving. The warthog ground to a halt in a cloud of dust, smoke, and foam. Silence followed. A silence so thick, so heavy, it felt like the whole world had stopped breathing. For a moment, nothing. No movement. No sound. Just the smoldering carcass of a jet, its wings riddled with holes wide enough to see daylight through. Then the canopy burst open. Rebecca pushed herself up, bloodied, exhausted, her arms trembling as she pulled free of the straps. She climbed out of the wreckage, boots sliding against the battered fuselage, and raised one hand, shaking, weak but unmistakable, a fist in the air. Defiance made flesh. The base erupted. Men and women screamed her call sign, voices raw, breaking into cheers that shook the runway. Havoc, havoc, havoc. Rebecca stood atop the battered bird, chest heaving, her flight suit torn and streaked with blood. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she let herself breathe. She was alive. The general stared from the crowd, frozen, humbled by the sight of the pilot he had already buried. The pilot who had defied death, defied odds, and clawed her way home in the ugliest bird in the sky. And in that moment, Rebecca realized something. Survival wasn't always about strength. Sometimes it was about stubbornness, about refusing to give in when the world had already written you off. The desert hadn't claimed her. Not today, not like this. Why did silence feel heavier than the roar of battle? Rebecca stood on the fuselage of her wrecked A-10, fist trembling in the air while the base thundered around her with cheers. Her name was being shouted like a battle cry, her call sign echoing across the runway. But inside there was only silence. Her body swayed, weak, her bloodied hands still clenched. She wasn't sure if the cheering reached her ears or if it was only the pounding of her pulse. She couldn't tell if she was standing tall or simply being held upright by adrenaline that hadn't yet drained away. Her chest heaved against the straps of her torn flight suit, every breath a war of its own. When she finally climbed down, boots hitting the concrete, the noise surged louder. Crews rushed forward, medics darting between them, fire hoses hissing against the smoldering wreck. Someone tried to steady her arm, but she shook them off. She was walking under her own power. She had to. The general was there. For a moment their eyes met across the sea of bodies. His face was pale, his jaw clenched tight as if words had abandoned him. He had been the one to declare her down, the one who had written her name off the board. And now here she was, bloodied, broken, but alive, proof that his certainty had been premature. Rebecca held his gaze, and for a heartbeat everything else vanished. The shouts, the cheers, the chaos, they all fell away. There was only that silence, only the unspoken truth hanging heavy between them. You buried me before I was gone. He looked away first. Medics swarmed her then, pressing gauze to her temple, checking her pupils, urging her toward a stretcher. She resisted, her voice hoarse but firm. Not yet. They argued, she insisted, and in the end she won, not because she was stronger but because they could see it in her eyes. She wasn't ready to let go, not yet. They walked her toward the operations building instead, every step a blur of faces, pilots saluting, crew members shouting her call sign, young soldiers staring at her as if she were something more than human. And that, more than the pain, unsettled her. She wasn't more. She wasn't invincible. She was just stubborn enough not to quit. Inside the briefing room, the air was colder, quieter. The chaos of the runway was sealed behind walls, replaced by the hum of machines and the murmur of officers. She lowered herself into a chair, her body screaming with pain the moment she stopped moving. Her ribs ached, her muscles shook, and blood still trickled warm from the cut on her temple. No one spoke at first. They just looked at her, the living ghost. Finally, the general cleared his throat. "Major Lane," he hesitated, words catching in his throat. His voice was softer than before, stripped of its steel. "We thought you were gone." Rebecca's eyes flicked to him. There was no triumph in her stare, no satisfaction, just weariness. "You declared me down before I stopped fighting." The room shifted uncomfortably. Officers avoided her gaze, staring at papers that didn't matter, screens that flickered with meaningless maps. The general's jaw tightened. "You weren't expected to survive that engagement," he said quietly. "No one would have blamed you for ejecting." Rebecca leaned back, pain flaring in her ribs. Her voice was low, steady, but sharp. "No one on the ground would have survived if I had." Silence again, heavy, suffocating. She thought of the soldiers in the valley, dug in against armor that would have crushed them. She thought of their voices breaking through the static, screaming her call sign, clinging to the sound of her cannon. That was why she hadn't left. That was why she had stayed in the fire when the sky told her to run. Not for orders, not for glory, for them. The general looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then he gave a small nod, acknowledgement, maybe even apology, but said nothing more. The debrief blurred. She answered their questions mechanically, target locations, enemy formations, weapon counts. Her voice steady despite the ache in her body. She gave them facts because that was all they seemed to want. But beneath it all, her thoughts drifted elsewhere. To the empty seats, to the voices missing from the room. Her squadron was gone. 3 pilots who had taken off with her that morning, 3 shadows that had flown into the same valley, 3 names she would never hear again in the ready room. Their laughter, their arguments, their small comforts in the dust of the desert, all silenced in fire. And here she was, sitting in a chair, blood drying on her face, being hailed as the survivor. The weight of it pressed down harder than any harness. Survivor's guilt, a phrase too clean for what it felt like. She excused herself before they finished, ignoring the protests of the medics. She walked out into the dusk alone, the desert wind cold against her skin. The wreck of her A-10 still sat on the runway, a burned, battered shell surrounded by crews. She stopped to look at it, the silhouette sharp against the fading light. It looked worse than she imagined. Holes punched through the wings, panels shredded, soot streaking across the fuselage. It shouldn't have flown, it shouldn't have survived, and yet it had carried her home, defiant to the last. Her chest tightened, and for the first time since landing, her eyes burned with something other than sweat and smoke. She placed her hand on the broken skin of the bird, metal still warm beneath her palm. "Thank you," she whispered. Behind her, footsteps crunched against the gravel. She turned slightly to see one of the youngest radar operators, the same one who had first spotted her return on the scope. His face was pale, his eyes wide, as if he still didn't believe she was real. "I told them it was you," he said quietly. "They didn't believe me. They said it was debris, clutter, but I knew you weren't gone." Rebecca studied him for a moment. He couldn't have been more than 20, still green, still carrying the awe of someone who hadn't yet learned how heavy war became. She gave him a small nod. "You trusted the signal," she said softly. He hesitated, then straightened his shoulders. "I trusted you." The words cut deeper than he knew. She managed a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Then she turned back to the bird, the desert wind tugging at her torn flight suit. The cheers had faded now. The chaos had quieted. The bass had returned to its rhythm, but for Rebecca, nothing was the same. She had landed. She had lived. But the question gnawed at her in the silence of her own mind. Why her? Why had she been spared when the others had? As the night settled over the desert, Rebecca Lane stood alone beside the wreckage of her warthog. Her shadow stretched long across the tarmac, and wondered if survival was victory or punishment. Why did they cheer for her when all she wanted was silence? The base was alive with whispers. Everywhere Rebecca walked, heads turned, voices dropped, eyes followed. Some looked at her with awe, others with disbelief, but the weight was the same. She had returned from the dead. She was the ghost who refused to stay buried. "Havoc's indestructible," she heard one young mechanic murmur when he thought she was out of earshot. She took the valley alone. She crawled home through hell. Rebecca's jaw clenched. Indestructible. If only they knew how heavy her body felt, how every step sent pain lancing through her bruised ribs, how her hands still trembled when she tried to hold a cup of water steady. She wasn't indestructible. She was barely holding together, just like the wreck of the A-10 now being stripped on the edge of the runway. Medics pushed her to rest, but rest never came. At night, when the base finally quieted and the desert wind slipped through the cracks, sleep turned into a battlefield of its own. She closed her eyes and saw it all again. The explosion of her wingman, the flash of fire in the canyon, the missile tearing through the tail of her jet. She heard the voices, the frantic calls for help, the static crackling with panic. And then, worst of all, she heard the silence. The silence of 3 men who had not come back. She would jolt awake, drenched in sweat, chest heaving, ribs screaming. Her flight suit lay folded in the corner, streaked with blood and soot, but she couldn't bear to look at it. She sat in the dark instead, staring at the walls, trying to steady her breathing, telling herself over and over, "You lived. You lived. You lived." But the question followed close behind. Why me? The base didn't ask that question. They didn't see the bruises, the cuts, the tremor in her hands. They saw the raised fist, the bloodied pilot who had stepped out of fire and onto the runway. They saw a story. And stories grow in war. Every day the tale spread wider. Pilots from other squadrons sought her out, shaking her hand, clapping her shoulder. Soldiers whispered her call sign with reverence. Havoc held the valley alone. Havoc brought the hog home on one engine. Havoc doesn't die. Rebecca forced polite smiles, nodded, gave short answers. But inside, the words scraped raw. She wasn't invincible. She wasn't untouchable. She was a woman who had almost died a dozen times in a single morning and couldn't close her eyes without seeing ghosts. The general summoned her 2 days after the landing. She walked into his office stiff-backed, hiding the limp in her step. He sat behind his desk, papers stacked in neat lines, his eyes heavy with something she couldn't quite name. Guilt, maybe, or the weight of command. "Major Lane," he said quietly. No bark in his tone now, no clipped steel, just quiet. "You've become the story on this base." Rebecca didn't answer. She stood at attention, her eyes fixed on the wall behind him. He sighed, leaning back. "What you did saved lives, more than you know. The men in that valley are still alive because you refused to quit. You've earned more than respect." He hesitated. "You've earned legend." Her jaw tightened. The word felt wrong in her ears. Legend. As if her survival was a myth to be polished and told around tables, while the real cost, the blood, the fire, the empty chairs in the ready room, was forgotten. "I didn't do it for legend," she said flatly. The general nodded once. "I know," he paused, "but the others will need it. Soldiers need stories to believe in, and right now you're theirs." She left without saluting. She wasn't sure if it was defiance or exhaustion. Outside, the desert sun burned her eyes. She walked past crews who saluted, past pilots who smiled, past soldiers who whispered her name. She wanted to shout at them, to tell them the truth, that she wasn't strong, that she wasn't fearless, that she hadn't wanted to be alone in that sky, that she would trade every cheer, every salute, every whisper of legend just to hear her wingmen's voices again. But she didn't. She let them believe, because maybe the general was right. Maybe soldiers needed stories. Maybe they needed to believe that survival was possible, that defiance could carry a broken machine home. That night she sat alone in her bunk, staring at the empty beds that should have been filled by her squadron. Her chest ached with every breath, her body broken in ways the medics hadn't yet measured. But worse than the pain was the quiet. She reached for her flight log, the battered leather book every pilot kept. She opened it, pen trembling in her hand. For a long time she stared at the page, blank except for the date. She wrote 3 names, her wingmen, each one followed by a silence so heavy it pressed against her ribs. Then she closed the log. She would carry them, not in stories, not in whispers, but in ink, in memory, in the weight of survival that pressed against her every time someone called her unbreakable. The desert outside roared with the wind, rattling the thin walls of her quarters. Rebecca closed her eyes, but not to sleep, to remember, to promise. She wasn't indestructible. She wasn't a legend. She was simply a pilot who had refused to fall when the world told her she was already gone. And in the quiet of that night, she wondered if that was enough. How do you climb back into a cockpit when every part of you still feels like it never left the last one? Rebecca stared at the replacement A-10 lined up on the tarmac. Fresh paint, intact wings, a machine untouched by the carnage that had shredded her old bird into scars and smoke. To anyone else it looked ready. To her it looked foreign, too clean, too whole, as if it didn't belong to her. The order had come down less than a week after she had limped home. Lane is cleared for flight. Mission schedule resumes. Cleared, that was the word they used. The medics had patched her cuts, strapped her ribs, told her to take it easy. The brass had nodded and signed off, eager to show the world that Havoc wasn't just a miracle survivor but still combat effective. She was the story now, and stories had to keep flying. She stood with her helmet under her arm, staring at the cockpit ladder. Her hands didn't move. Her chest tightened, each breath scraping her bruised ribs. Sweat prickled along her spine despite the cool morning air. Voices behind her carried on the wind. Crews talking, pilots laughing. She caught fragments. "She'll be fine, Havoc always is. Indestructible, they say. Desert can't kill her." The words pressed against her like weights. Indestructible. Legend. They didn't see the tremor in her fingers. They didn't hear the pounding in her chest. They didn't smell the smoke that lingered in her nightmares. Rebecca closed her eyes. For a heartbeat she was back there. the missile slamming into her tail, the cockpit screaming with alarms, her ribs cracking against the harness, the earth rising up like jagged teeth. She heard the silence of her wingmen's voices, gone in fire. She felt the stick fighting her hands, the bird shuddering like it wanted to die. Her eyes snapped open, the tarmac, the sun, the replacement A-10 waiting. She forced herself forward one step at a time until her boot hit the ladder. She climbed, her body heavy, her breath shallow. Sliding into the cockpit felt wrong. Too smooth, too clean. Her hands hovered over the controls, the switches gleaming instead of charred. The seat didn't creak with old scars. It didn't feel alive. She strapped in, her movements mechanical, as if her body remembered what her mind refused. The canopy closed with a hiss, sealing her inside. Instantly, her pulse spiked. The space felt smaller, tighter. The walls pressed against her ribs, her throat constricted. Breathe. She pressed her helmet against the seat back, shutting her eyes. In the darkness, the silence of the cockpit twisted. It wasn't silence at all. It was memory, explosions, screams, the tearing metal of her squadron being ripped from the sky. Her hand trembled as it hovered over the throttle. She couldn't move it. She couldn't force herself to push forward. The radio crackled. Havoc, confirm ready for taxi. Her mouth was dry, words stuck in her throat. She tried to swallow, but it felt like choking. She wanted to say no, wanted to unstrap, to climb out, to admit the truth, that she wasn't ready, that she wasn't indestructible, that she was just a woman barely holding herself together. But she didn't. Her voice came out steady, flat. Copy, taxiing. The engines roared to life, the beast beneath her awakening. The vibration rattled through her chest, too familiar, too close to memory. Her ribs ached where the harness had bruised them days earlier. She gritted her teeth, forcing the sensation into the background. The jet rolled forward. The runway stretched out like a scar across the earth. Rebecca's hand clamped down on the throttle. She shoved it forward and the A-10 surged ahead. The weight pressed her back into the seat. For a heartbeat, her lungs froze. Then the wheels lifted and the ground fell away. The sky swallowed her whole again. Her breath came shallow, quick. Every bump of turbulence sent panic flashing like lightning through her veins. Every shadow across the desert floor looked like missile smoke. Her eyes darted across the sky, scanning, searching, waiting for the ambush that wasn't there. Her squadron's voices filled the comms, steady, routine, but her ears strained for the ones that weren't there, for the laughter she would never hear again. The silence pressed harder than any enemy fire. She kept flying, because she had to, because they needed Havoc, the unbreakable. But inside, Rebecca Lane was breaking. When they landed hours later, mission complete with no casualties, the base cheered again. Crews clapped her shoulder, pilots grinned, the general himself nodded with approval. She smiled where they could see. She answered their questions, brief, professional. She gave them Havoc, the story. Then she walked back to her quarters, shut the door and slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, helmet still in her lap. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Her breath came ragged. Her chest burned with more than bruises. She pressed her forehead against the helmet, eyes shut tight. I can't keep doing this. But she had to. Because they needed the legend more than they needed the truth. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and the guilt and the exhaustion, Rebecca knew she couldn't let go of the stick. Not yet. Not while others were still out there, waiting for the sound of her cannon in the sky. How long can a person carry the weight of a myth before it crushes them? Rebecca lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, the desert wind howling outside the thin walls. She hadn't slept. Not really. Sleep came in fragments, minutes stolen between jolts awake, her body drenched in sweat, heart racing, the echo of explosions still rattling her ribs. Every night was the same. She saw the missile slamming into her tail. She felt the jet twist beneath her, metal screaming as she fought for control. She heard the silence of her wingmen, gone in fire. And every time, just before she hit the canyon wall, she woke, gasping, shaking, the taste of smoke and blood thick in her mouth. But when morning came, she put on the mask. She walked the base with her shoulders squared, her stride steady, her eyes sharp. Havoc, the indestructible, Havoc, the legend. She let them believe it, because belief kept the base moving. Still, every whisper carved into her, every salute pressed heavier. Every Havoc doesn't die echoed against the truth that she felt dead inside already. The missions hadn't stopped. They kept sending her out. Every time she strapped into a cockpit, her chest clenched, her fingers trembled, her lungs burned with shallow breaths. But once the wheels lifted, once the desert spread below, there was no turning back. She flew because that's what they demanded of her. And every time she returned, the base cheered louder. It came to a head one evening after a sortie. Rebecca had landed without incident, another mission flown, another day survived. She walked into the operations building, her body aching, her eyes burning. The general was waiting for her. "Major Lane," he said, his tone flat, "good work today." She gave a curt nod, dropped her helmet onto the table and turned to leave. "Sit," he said. Her jaw tightened. She didn't want to, but she did. Slowly, stiffly, lowering herself into the chair across from him. He studied her for a long moment, his fingers steepled, his eyes heavy. "You've become something bigger than yourself here." Rebecca's voice was sharp. "I didn't ask for that." "No," he admitted, "but it doesn't change the reality. Soldiers talk about you, crews talk about you, they believe you can't be killed." "I can," she snapped, louder than she meant to, her chest heaved. Her ribs flared with pain. She leaned forward, eyes burning into his. "I can, I bleed, I break. I wake up every night choking on smoke that isn't there. I hear their voices, the ones who didn't come back. And you," her voice cracked, but she forced it steady, "you buried me before I was even gone. Don't you dare stand there and tell me I'm indestructible." The general didn't flinch. He let her words hang heavy in the air. Finally he spoke, quiet, "You're right." Rebecca blinked, thrown by the softness in his tone. "I did bury you," he said. "I did mark you down as gone, because I believed no one could have survived what you flew through. And when you came back, I realized something. You weren't supposed to. By every calculation, you should be dead. But you weren't. And that makes men believe in things they shouldn't." His eyes lifted to hers, steady now. "They need that belief. Do you understand? They're out there fighting a war that strips them bare, that eats away at their hope. And then they see you. They see Havoc crawling home when no one else could. They see a story that says maybe, just maybe, they can survive too. And that belief," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "is keeping some of them alive." Rebecca's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to shout, to break, but the words tangled inside her. Because wasn't that what she had done? Stayed in the fire for the men on the ground because they needed her cannon in the sky. Given everything she had left, not for orders, not for glory, but because they needed to believe someone was still fighting for them. The general leaned back. "You don't have to like it, you don't have to want it, but right now you're more than a pilot, you're a symbol. And symbols," he trailed off, then gave a weary sigh, "symbols don't get to choose." The words landed like a blade. Rebecca stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Her hands shook, her chest burning. She couldn't stay in the room, not with him, not with those words. She stormed out into the night air, the desert cold against her skin. She walked fast, boots crunching against gravel, until the noise of the base dimmed and only the wind remained. She stopped, pressing her hands against her knees, head bowed, breath ragged. She hated him for being right. She hated herself more for understanding. Because she had seen it. In the eyes of the soldiers who whispered her name, in the grip of the mechanic's handshake, in the radar operator's quiet faith. They didn't see Rebecca Lane. They saw Havoc. They saw the ghost who defied the desert. And that gave them something to hold onto in the dust and fire. But what about her? Who saw her shaking hands? Who saw the bruises that never seemed to fade? who saw the nights she couldn't breathe for the weight of ghosts pressing down on her chest. No one. Because Rebecca Lane was gone, havoc was all that remained. She sank to the ground, knees drawn up, staring at the horizon where the desert bled into the night. Her body trembled, but her eyes stayed dry. She was past tears, past anger. All that remained was the hollow ache of survival. The desert was quiet. For once, no alarms, no gunfire, no roar of engines, just silence. A silence that felt too wide, too heavy, too permanent. She whispered into it, her voice hoarse. "I'm not indestructible." The wind carried her words away. No one heard, no one ever would. But somewhere deep inside, a small, stubborn ember still burned. The same ember that had kept her hands on the stick when the desert tried to tear her down. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. And maybe that was enough. What does survival mean when it leaves you carrying ghosts? Rebecca walked the flight line at dawn, the sky painted in pale gold and soft blues. The base was just waking, crews moving slow, voices low. Engines hadn't yet broken the silence. For once, the desert was still. She stopped beside the skeleton of her old A-10, what remained of the bird that had dragged her home through fire. It was stripped now, its wings dismantled, its panels piled like bones. The crews called it salvage. To Rebecca, it felt like a funeral. Her hand touched the battered metal, fingertips tracing the holes torn through its skin. This bird had bled for her. It had carried her when nothing else could. She had promised herself she wouldn't abandon it, and she hadn't. She had landed it, broken but alive, just like herself. Behind her, footsteps approached. She didn't turn. "Thought I'd find you here," the young radar operator said quietly. The one who had refused to dismiss her signal, the one who had believed she wasn't gone when everyone else had. Rebecca glanced back at him. His uniform still looked too new, his eyes still too young. He shifted awkwardly, then gave a small smile. "They're saying they'll put what's left of it in a museum one day, call it Havoc's Hog." She didn't smile back, but she nodded, turning her gaze back to the wreck. "They'll make it bigger than it was," she murmured. "Make it into a story, something polished." "Maybe," he admitted, "but maybe stories keep people going." Rebecca didn't answer. The boy hesitated, then stepped closer. "You know, when I saw your signal, I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't just dots on a screen. It was like hope, like proof that sometimes the impossible happens." Her throat tightened. She looked away before he could see the flicker in her eyes. "The impossible doesn't happen," she said softly. "Just stubborn pilots who refuse to quit." He didn't argue. He just stood there quiet, as if his silence was the answer she needed. When he finally left, Rebecca remained alone with the wreck. The sun climbed higher, burning away the chill. Her shadow stretched long across the concrete, dark against the bird's twisted frame. She closed her eyes. For a moment she let the silence wash over her, not the heavy silence of nightmares, but something softer, quieter. Memory came. The laughter of her squadron in the ready room, the sound of boots on metal ladders, the voices crackling through the comms before the valley turned to fire. She let herself hear them, not as ghosts, not as echoes, but as pieces of herself she would never let go. When she opened her eyes, the wreck was still there. The desert was still endless. The war was still grinding on. Nothing had changed, and yet something had. Rebecca Lane was not indestructible. She was not immortal. She was not the legend they whispered about in mess halls or painted on briefing boards. She was just a woman who had refused to quit when quitting was easier. And maybe that was what strength really was. Not glory, not defiance, just the quiet decision again and again to keep going, to lift the stick when the bird wanted to fall, to breathe when the world pressed down, to fight when the silence told you were already gone. That afternoon, the general called her in. Another mission, another column pushing through, another valley waiting. Rebecca listened. She nodded. She accepted the orders, Not because she wanted the cheers, not because she wanted to be a story, but because there would be men on the ground who needed her. Men who would look up at the sky, praying for the sound of her cannon, praying for havoc to come. And she would come. Not because she was a legend, not because she was unbreakable, but because she was Rebecca Lane and she had made a choice long ago. When she strapped into her new bird, the cockpit smelled different, cleaner, lacking the scars she had trusted. Her chest tightened, but her hands moved steady over the controls. The canopy sealed, the world shrinking again. Her breath came slow, her ribs still ached, her hands still trembled faintly. But she didn't fight the tremor this time. She let it be. Proof she was human, proof she wasn't the ghost they believed her to be. The engines roared, the ground shook, the bird came alive. And Rebecca Lane lifted into the sky once more, carrying not just her own survival, but the memory of those who hadn't returned, and the silent promise that as long as she flew, their story flew with her. The desert stretched below, the war raged on, the silence waited. But havoc was still in the sky. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.